I'm not a Shakespearean scholar, but I know a thing or two about his work, especially the famous and frequently adapted Romeo and Juliet. This is one of the most recognizable plays in the entire world, so well known that I don't see the point in recounting its subject matter or plot. Romeo and Juliet are, to this day, the most famous example of star-crossed lovers. The only reason we use the phrase star-crossed lovers is because of Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet.
From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
This classic story about romance, violence, and feuds struck an emotional chord in audiences so deep that traces of Romeo and Juliet can be found in places where you least expect them. And yeah, that's kinda just Shakespeare having a hand deep in every type of genre you can imagine, but saying Shakespeare's everywhere is not the point of this video. Romeo and Juliet, however, is. You can find traces of Romeo and Juliet in High School Musical, where Troy Bolton and the Wildcats basketball team are essentially the Montagues, and Gabriella Montez and the Nerds are essentially the Capulets. You can find it in Warm Bodies, where the zombie R and his zombie friends are essentially the Montagues, and Julie, the human trying to survive the zombie apocalypse, is essentially a Capulet. And West Side Story is one of the most iconic reiterations of Romeo and Juliet. Originating as a play in 1957, it was quickly adapted for the screen in 1961. It sets the stage in 1950s New York and focuses on a rivalry between two gangs, the Sharks, who are Puerto Rican, and the Jets, who are white. Given the concept of Romeo and Juliet, that of two young lovers who can't be together due to their feuding families, modern adaptations of the story emphasize the difference between the Montagues and the Capulets. Why don't these families like each other? Could it be a class dispute between the rich and the poor, like what we see in Titanic? Story about racial barriers and societal expectations to date within your own race, like what we see in West Side Story, China Girl, and Mississippi Masala? Or a political story with Romeo and Juliet caught in the middle between two opposing sides of war? This element of Romeo and Juliet is a big part of how and why it's maintained its relevance for so many years. There have been adaptations for every single one of these scenarios. And then there's my favorite iteration of Romeo and Juliet, which, don't laugh, is amazing.
Here's to my love, that drugs are quick. That's with the kiss I die.
Who is it? Romeo. How long have he been there? Oh, half an hour.
What's here? A cup closed in my true love's hand. Poison, I see has been his timeless end. Old churl drunk all and left no friendly drop.
My point is, there have been so many versions of Romeo and Juliet, so many reinterpretations from stage plays to television to animation to film to manga, and with so many varying adaptations, it's safe to say that we've seen a lot of versions of this story from different cultures. There are Mexican retellings of Romeo and Juliet, Japanese retellings, Indian retellings. It goes on and on. So when you have a story that is this beloved, this universal, and this embedded in the fabric of storytelling, what's the problem with an adaptation? What's the issue with telling it in a new way? What, pray tell, is the problem if Juliet is black? There's a really passionate anger that seems to crop up when any actor of color just appears in a world that has been traditionally white for many, many years. I don't enjoy the Star Wars series myself, let me just lay that out right now. It's not that it's bad or anything, it's just something that I couldn't really click with, and that's okay. But beyond not having a connection to it, I now have a bad taste in my mouth about the entire universe of those stories, just because of some very vocal and very racist fanboys. I didn't watch The Last Jedi, but I have vivid memories of the horrible tweets directed at Kelly Marie Tran, just for existing in that universe. Not for playing a character that's usually depicted as white, not for stepping on any major character's toes, no, just for being there. That's sick. And not like when you see someone do a 180 on the half pipe, it's a different kind of sickness I'm talking about. Quvenzhané Wallis had to deal with a lot of disrespect when she was nominated for her first Academy Award at 9 years old. People mispronouncing her name, sometimes intentionally.
This is how you say my name. Quvenzhané Wallis.
People calling her derogatory names online. It was a whole mess. But the mess didn't end with the culmination of the 85th Academy Awards. In 2014, Wallis would helm a remake of Annie, a reimagining that sees Little Orphan Annie in modern-day New York. When folks found out that this reimagining was going to focus on a little black girl, all hell broke loose. Last year, we saw a bit of that hell when Halle Bailey played Ariel in a remake of The Little Mermaid, when Leah Jeffries was announced as Annabeth Chase for the series adaptation of Percy Jackson, when Rachel Zegler was announced as Snow White, and even more astounding when Avantika wasn't announced as Rapunzel. Seriously, there's no announcement. there is no live-action Tangled movie in the works as of yet. That young woman's comments are full of the most racist, vitriolic shit because of a fan cast that holds no weight for a movie that does not exist. You can't tell me that some of these people are only mad about casting inaccuracies when they didn't even bother to check if it was real before flooding her Instagram and making crying TikToks. Sometimes casting announcements make people so upset that even when the race of the actress matches the race of the character, they still get mad. Most recently, the young and upcoming actress Francesca Amiwodo Rivers has received a deluge of racist abuse online shortly after it was announced that she would be playing Juliet in the Jamie Lloyd directed production. This response is enraging, saddening, but unfortunately, not that surprising. It feels repetitive because we've seen it happen before. Many times. It doesn't seem to matter what the role is, what the source material is, how much of a reimagining the new story is. The response is mostly the same. In most of the examples I mentioned, the stories being adapted or remade are very contemporary. The first Annie film came out in 1982 based on a play that came out in 1977. The first installment of the Percy Jackson series was published in 2005. So to a certain extent, I guess I can understand having a passionate reaction to an update on a story that feels so new, a story that thus far hasn't been retold that many times. But in the case of The Little Mermaid and Snow White, these stories have existed for centuries as fairy tales, long before they were animated Disney films. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, a story that has existed for well over 400 years and has seen so many different versions, homages, and reimaginings that it's hard to keep up with, I kind of don't understand. It's pretty common for Romeo and Juliet adaptations to change things a bit, shake them up, changing settings, time periods, turning it into a musical, changing the ending, making the characters a bit older. Lloyd Kaufman's Romeo and Juliet, for example, is a ridiculous, subversive, needlessly grotesque adaptation that has a penchant for shock value. It reimagines the story as gritty and surreal, turning every character into a dirtbag and implementing sexual violence for the hell of it. It also changes the ending to a happy one. Happy-ish. The two lovers live and stay together forever, but the sick part comes in where we find out that Romeo and Juliet are actually brother and sister. As I said earlier, West Side Story reimagines the play to be about warring gangs and racial tension in 1950s New York. There have been theater productions that set the story in high school during apartheid in South Africa. Each time a new version of the story is told, it's usually met with some intrigue, if not all-out excitement. Like if I told you that there was a reimagining of Romeo and Juliet set in the 1920s and it had to do with two children of two opposing bootleggers falling in love, and there's like gang violence and prohibition, and does that not sound promising? Would you not be intrigued by that? Are you not entertained? That's why it's so curious to me that this story is allowed to change in so many ways. Time periods, setting, the circumstances of the conflict between the Montagues and the Capulets. Shit, even their surnames can change. But for some reason, whenever there's a person of color playing Romeo or Juliet, suddenly change and reimaginings are a big problem. Suddenly they're insulting. Suddenly they're destroying Shakespeare's legacy. Despite the fact that productions in the West End are constantly casting actors of color for Shakespeare, and that's been the case for years, people wouldn't even know about this play if not for Tom Holland playing a role, and they probably wouldn't even care all that much. I mean, there's a version of Romeo and Juliet where they aren't even human. They're lawn gnomes. What the fuck is that? But there's no outrage from anyone saying, wait a second now, Juliet was actually a human, because it sounds ridiculous. Plus, technically, there is no phenotypic description of Juliet. Romeo alludes to her brightness often, and if you interpret that literally, then maybe that means she's pale. Maybe. But given the amount of metaphorical language weaved throughout the story, given how often Romeo describes Juliet as being his son, then it also kind of just sounds like she's, to quote T.S. Eliot, the still point in the turning world. Like the sun, Romeo's world revolves around her. She is the center of his universe. And we hear this sort of comparison in love songs pretty often.
Ain't no sunshine when she's gone.
So when Romeo makes references to Juliet brightening his day or being comparable to the sun, it can't be taken as a cut and clear interpretation that she's fair. At least not to me. I don't know, I did say I wasn't a Shakespearean scholar. But let's completely disregard that there is no description of Juliet's appearance. If we're going to act like everything needs to be completely accurate to Shakespeare's original work, then can we acknowledge the fact that there is no balcony in the original play? There was an article about this in The Atlantic a few years ago. My bad. a decade ago. Jesus Christ. And it's a really fascinating read. The balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet is such an iconic scene that whenever you see it somewhere in pop culture, your brain just yells, Romeo and Juliet! That's Romeo and Juliet right there! There's even a style of balconies called Juliet balconies, just because of the play, but it's not in the original play. In the actual play, it just says it's a window. So I have to ask, how much do we really care about this story or any adaptation being rigidly faithful to the original? And while we're at it, if it is such a big deal, should it mean that every white actress who did play Juliet should have been of Italian descent, since the story does take place in Fair Verona? All of these questions are rhetorical, of course, because the people making a big fuss and flooding Rivers' social media with the most egregiously hateful, spiteful shit that you have ever seen, it has nothing to do with having a deep respect for Shakespeare, and it has nothing to do with maintaining historical accuracy. In fact, I would argue that most of the people complaining haven't seen a Shakespeare play, or at least if they have seen one, they haven't been to the theater in a while. Because if they had, they would know just how common it is for Shakespeare to be performed by actors of color. And not just Othello. Back in 1936, Orson Welles directed a Macbeth play with an all-black cast, commonly known as Voodoo Macbeth. Despite some initial controversy, the play went on to become rather successful. In 2013, a Romeo and Juliet play starring Orlando Bloom and Condola Rashad ran on Broadway from September to December. Rashad had an interview with NPR a month after the show first started running, where she addressed her casting and the public's response to it. While, for the most part, the backlash was minimal, and I don't think it was on the level of what Rivers is currently experiencing, Rashad said she still got a lot of hateful messages.
I won't get into it too much, but when I first started playing this role of Juliet, I received quite a few nasty tweets. I wasn't angry about it, but it really did wake me up and realizing, there are people who really are not going to be comfortable with this.
In the musical Anne Juliet, a version of the story that reimagines an ending where Juliet doesn't die, Miriam Teakley played Juliet in the show's first run in 2019. And in 2017, a version of the play called Romeo and Juliet in Harlem, a multiracial cast. In 2000, the Royal Shakespeare Company cast David Oyelowo to play King Henry. Hugh Corshi said the move was great, but that it wasn't a big improvement, citing that switching out races was fairly common in Shakespeare and that the real challenge came for inclusivity in modern plays. Remember, this is like 20 years ago. This is not a defining moment for black actors. It is a lot easier to have non-traditional casting with Shakespeare. In fact, this seems only possible in the classics at all these days. The real problems for black actors come with modern plays and the cinema. To his point, 24 years later, in small and large theaters all over the world, actors of color study and perform Shakespeare all the time. And not just in theater. We've seen black actors take on important roles in Shakespeare plays and retellings many times. Where would we be without Denzel Washington in Much Ado About Nothing? Or Harold Perrineau's take on Mercutio and Baz Luhrmann's maximalist, bombastic fever dream of a film. Let me tell you something, Perrineau walked into that audition 3 times and served cunt each and every time. His take on Mercutio is perhaps my favorite, and I would guess for a lot of people, the most memorable. Even though black actors have studied and performed Shakespeare for years, there's always a little bit of pushback when a black actor is cast in a role, or when, say, an Othello production receives criticism for once again casting a white actor as Othello. For a lot of Shakespeare characters, race is never mentioned, and I touched on this before in an old video about how the absence of a description for characters intended to be white reinforces the idea that whiteness is the default. It's very common to pick up a book and start reading and see descriptions of a character like their hair, their eye color, etc. So it always stands out when in that same book there's suddenly a description of a character and now it mentions that they're black or East Asian, South Asian, Latin. The whiteness default is a problem for a multitude of reasons, including the general ickiness of making whiteness the standard, but it also has a negative impact on the writing itself. See, if you don't explicitly describe a character as white, it leaves a lot of things open to interpretation, and in the case of Othello is, I want to say, the only Shakespeare character whose skin color is described, and that's because the play is centered around his otherness. But it was common practice for white actors to play Othello. Laurence Olivier even received an Oscar nomination for his depiction of the character. Years later, Richard Dreyfuss, a renowned actor, lamented the attempt at Oscar's diversity and said,
Laurence Olivier was the last white actor to play Othello. And he did it in 1965, and he did it in blackface. And he played a black man brilliantly. Am I being told that I will never have a chance to play a black man?
And this is a really common refrain that I can't help but to have noticed. If a black actor is cast in a role like this, the pushback will be against their inclusion because it's interpreted as being at the expense or at the exclusion of white actors. But mostly white productions of Shakespeare or any other play are put on all the time without anyone ever thinking it's at the exclusion of actors of color. As I said before, it was common practice for white actors to play Othello, so common that if you suggested putting a black actor in a role that was explicitly described as being black, you would be laughed out of the room. In a lot of these stories, whether it's Shakespeare or a fairy tale, the race of the character isn't explicitly described, so what people end up doing is tracing the story back to its roots. And that's what people are doing with this latest Romeo and Juliet outrage, by saying that because the story is set in Verona, Juliet could only have been white. Fair enough. But let's do that with another story, tracing its origins back as far as we can go. The two earliest Cinderella stories can be traced back to ancient Greece and ancient China. The one from ancient China has more detail, and more in common with the version of Cinderella we've come to know. Now, the story was called Yexian. The story had a young woman whose mother passed away when she was a baby, and whose father dies suddenly when she's a young girl, forcing her to become a servant for her evil stepmother. The only love she receives is from a giant fish, who she befriends in the lake behind her house. When her stepmother discovers the fish and that Yexian is fucking around being happy behind her back, the audacity, she catches the fish and serves it for dinner. Yexian is devastated, but is advised by a spirit to place the bones of the fish under the corners of her bed, and that if she has a need, she can tell the bones and it will come true. Instead of a ball, there is a New Year's festival that doubles as an opportunity for matchmaking. The evil stepmother forces Yexian to stay home so that her daughter has a better chance of finding a husband. Yexian wants to go to the festival, so she makes a wish to the bones, and suddenly she's cloaked in the most beautiful green dress and tiny golden slippers that look to be made of fish scales. She goes to the festival, and well, the rest you probably already know. This ancient tale eventually made its way to Europe, where it started to become the version of the story we see now. When it was retold by Charles Perrault, that's when we got the Cinderella elements that have become synonymous with the story. Giant pumpkins, glass slippers, fairy godmothers, you know the deal. And if we look at all the Cinderella stories over the years, it's safe to say that this is the version people are most often adapting. It's not the original story or the first version of the story, but a retelling that has become so popularized that it's now considered to be the standard. And I have a feeling, despite Perrault's version not being the first version of Cinderella, that if a Chinese American woman was cast in a retelling of Cinderella, there'd be people crying about it on TikTok, even if it was a retelling that did without giant pumpkins, glass slippers, and fairy godmothers. That's the thing about this outrage. It doesn't really feel like it's about having a black Juliet. There have been black Juliets before. There have been black Romeos before. There have been Juliets and Romeos of all kinds of backgrounds and all different sorts of settings. It's about a few white people feeling othered and excluded after centuries of being the main focus of these stories, after being made the focus so often that it feels like the norm, and anything outside of that is a breach of their trust and security. It's also about fandoms. As I said, Condola Rashad and her take as Juliet received quite a few messages on Twitter from people outraged at her casting. But it seems like the outrage that's been lobbied at Rivers feels more intense. Combine social media with the current socio-political climate, featureism, texturism, and entitled fans who are only paying attention to this play because of superstar Tom Holland. Well, it's a different kind of beast. I've seen some of the most cruel things said about this young woman, and I would rather not repeat any of it. I do want to say that the backlash and the hate that she's received, it hasn't just been about her race. A lot of people have been throwing shots at her appearance as well. And even though part of me does want to share some of the things I've seen, just so I can talk about how black women tend to be hyper-criticized for their appearance and how that's like tenfold for dark-skinned black women. And I'd rather not go into detail. I'd rather not immortalize their cruel words in this video that, I don't know, people might come back to this years later. Who knows? And do I really want to have included a shrine to their spite? Not really. But I will say that this reaction and seeing how people have spoken about this young woman online has been absolutely heartbreaking, and it's a case of virulent, violent misogynoir. And it's just one example of how black women, especially unambiguously black women, are viewed and treated. People are only willing to accept black as beautiful when their features aren't too Afrocentric, when their complexion is lighter, when their curls are looser. I experience the world as a Black woman, but I don't experience it as a dark-skinned Black woman. I know that I have a lot of privilege, and I think other light-skinned women like myself, light-skinned people in general, need to be more aware and more willing to not only acknowledge their privilege, but like call out people when they see colorism in action. It's very easy for some of us to just turn away from colorism and not acknowledge it and not call it out. But we have to see it, call it out, check your friends, check your family, and check yourself. Every time there's outrage like this, I'm sad at how unsurprising it is. The same people outraged often fall back on this argument, that instead of remakes and retellings starring Black leads or any other actor of color, there should be more original stories about them. But then when there are original stories with Black leads, we still see a bit of that outrage. People can say they want original stories with Black leads all they want, but even when there are original stories, the instinct for some of these people is to be offended anyway. The trailer for The Blackening was met with disappointment because, oh no, they're Black and it's about being Black in a horror movie, the horror. The trailer for Chevalier was divisive because, oh no, a Black lead in a movie set in the 1700s based on the life of a Black man who was living in France during the 1700s. The horror! So when I see reactions to original stories like these and then see reactions to retellings like these, it becomes pretty clear that the issue people have isn't with Black actors playing typically white roles. The issue people seem to have is with Black actors. I said it earlier and I'll say it again. Our existence is so politicized that just existing in a movie is enough to make people mad, whether it's an original or a retelling. I wish I could say it has improved since the day of Amandla Stenberg as Rue, but it hasn't, and I'm starting to fear that it won't.